Peace. I just wanted to make another part of this video. I forgot to read this because I know this was an article. I know this was something that Peter Buttigieg talked about from the video that I did. I just wanted to dig in deep about Robert Moses in case those don't know about Robert Moses and the stuff that he's done within his tenure of being a city and environmental planner, especially in New York. I just want to read this article so y'all can see what's going on. So I'm going to read this. Robert Moses in the saga of the racist Parkway bridges. Shout outs to Glenn Kessler. I'm surprised. I'm still surprised that some people were surprised when I pointed to the fact that if a highway was built for the purpose of dividing a white and a black neighborhood, or if an underpass was constructed such that a bus carrying mostly Black and Puerto Rican kids to a beach, or that would have been, in New York was designed too low for it to pass by, and that obviously reflects racism that went into those design choices. And like I told y'all from the past video, I believe Pete Buttigieg is only doing this only because of the fact of the matter that this is a whole entire talking point about these liberals. And then the thing about these liberals is all their whole entire point is to make the so-called white supremacy or white rulership feel bad, in which the so-called white man doesn't care. The white rulership, they understand that they can do whatever they want without any, they know the history. They know exactly what happened because they did it purposely. So what is it now? You be accountable for your actions? What is it going to fix? Now, would this be one of those sort of things where so-called Black people arise and be like, okay, they did this foul shit, so let's create our own suburbs. Let's create our own little micro cities. Let's buy our own land and our eminent domain so we can forget about all this, real estate nonsense that takes place even in 2021. There's questions you have to ask. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg remarks at the White House November 8th. When Buttigieg made these comments at the White House, some right-leaning Twitter users immediately cried foul. It is possible to get a Glenn Kessler fact check that structural engineers purposely built racist overpasses. Well, our knee jerked. This was obviously a reference to one of the most famous anecdotes in Robert Carroll's majestic biography of Robert Moses, the power broker. A transportation department official confirmed that Buttigieg was referring to Carroll's Pulitzer Prize winning work. The New York Historical Society, which is currently featuring an exhibition on Cairo's reportage, also weighed in. Bridges spanning Robert Moses Long Island parkways had a clearance too low for buses to pass under. The organization said in a tweet, this meant anyone who could not travel by car, including low-income families and people of color, to a long journey of over local roads, effectively barring them from Moses Parks. A spokesperson said the tweets were based on exhibition labels. But then we heard from Peter Schulman, an associate professor of history at Case Western Reserve University. He said that this story has been largely debunked, so we decided to look deeper. There is a little dispute over the first part of Buttigieg's comment regarding the building of highways, which is well documented across the country. And I mean, look, listen, I know that they're gonna go ahead and say, oh, this is false, it wasn't racist and all this other stuff. Look, my belief system stays as stance. When it came to the white rulership, yes, they was going to make it harder for so-called Black people to have access to certain places, especially in New York and suburban areas in New York. They wanted you to stay confined to the urban areas. I mean, it's the same thing they did in Chicago. I don't know if it was the neighborhood Woodlawn or this, that, and the third. It was some type of neighborhood out there they didn't want so-called Black people moving to, especially when it came to the suburbs amongst so-called white people. And I mean, there's a documentary that came out, there was a documentary, I forgot what year it came out, where they documented a so-called Black family moving to a place in Queens, Rochdale, Queens in the 1970s, where there was all this racism between so-called white people and so-called black people. More specifically, they was calling these so-called black kids the N-word, and it was coming from so-called white kids and all these different things and stuff like that in 1970. But then guess what? If you go to Jamaica, Queens now, you go to Rochdale, there's that big population of so-called black people in a relatively middle-class income so-called black neighborhood. So, I mean, the outcome can still be good for so-called black people. And let's get to the facts. Few men have had as much impact on the design of a city than Robert Moses. He built the highways and bridges that crisscross New York City. He constructed hundreds of playgrounds, sports fields, and urban pools. He built housing developments such as Stuyvesant Town, Riverside Park, the United Nations headquarters, and the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. And he designed beautiful beaches and state parks on Long Island and across New York and the parkways that led people to them. At the peak of his influence, Moses was more powerful than any mayor or governor, even though he was not elected. Cairo's book, published in 1974, is mostly a study of power and how power corrupts, depicting the transformation of an idealist reformer into a tyrant who created slums and destroyed communities without remorse. The 1,200-page book, a feature of astonishing reporting and writing, is generally regarded as one of the 100 greatest works of nonfiction. It destroyed Moses' reputation and shaped how people think about his legacy. Cairo also casts Moses as a racist who made it harder for people of color to visit his properties. Buttigieg referenced one of the book's most famous anecdotes, which appears on pages 318 and 319. This section of the book concerns the construction of one of Moses' greatest achievements, Jones Beach State Parks, which opened in 1929. Moses also constructed parkways such as Southern State Parkway in the 1920s that took people to the beach. And I'll read this. Moses began to limit access by buses. He instructed Sharpio to build the bridges across his new parkways too low for buses to pass. Bus trips therefore had to be made on local roads, making the trips discouraging, long, and arduous. For Negroes who he considered inherently dirty, there were further measures. Buses needed permits to enter state parks. Buses chartered by Negroes groups found it very difficult to obtain permits, especially to Moses' beloved Jones Beach. Most were shunted off to parks many miles further on Long Island. And even in those parks, buses carrying Negro groups were discouraged from using white beach areas, the best beaches, by a system Sharpio calls flagging. The handful of Negro lifeguards, there were only a handful of Negro employees among the thousands employed by the Long Island State Park Commission, were also stationed at distant, least developed beaches. Moses was convinced that Negroes did not like cold water. The temperature at the pool at Jones Beach was deliberately icy to keep Negroes out. I mean, that's probably going off of the stigma that so-called black people can't swim. So, I mean, yeah, it could, I was going to say it could be a red herring, but that's not the right word or term to use. I mean, it's a smoke signal. It could be virtue signaling. It could be anything. It could be him saying things in a certain way without it being said. When the government, well, it would give him more of a reason to say, it would give him that type of ploy to do something like that, to say, oh, well, you know, they don't like water. This is the whole entire thing I believe Robert Moses was trying to say, but he didn't want to appear racist. He was speaking in code. When then Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt gingerly raised the matter of the treatment of Black Americans with Moses, Kairos writes that Moses put him off and FDR never raised it again. Sharpio was Sidney M. Sharpio, a close Moses associate and former chief engineer and general manager of the Long Island State Park Commission. He was a major source for Cairo. The source notes say that Sharpio granted 100 hours of interviews with Cairo with the understanding that nothing could be used unless he died. And he passed away in 1972, 2 years before publication. In the endnotes, Sharpio is listed as one of the only sources for the order to keep the bridges of parkways low. Sharpio, along with Paul Kern, a law secretary at City Hall under Mayor Fiorella LaGuardia, which is the reason why LaGuardia Airport is named LaGuardia Airport, are listed as sources for Moses believing Black Americans were dirty. Kern and Paul Wendell's LaGuardia's Corporation Counsel are the sources for the details on the bus permits and pool temperature. As an example of Cairo's research, the New York Historical Society exhibition displayed tally sheets made by Cairo and his wife in 1967 showing how, decades later, few Blacks went to the park. There's an understanding on that. I don't have anything else to say. But let's see. But since The Power Broker was published, as always in history, there has been some revisionism, and Moses' achievements are now viewed in a better light. In particular, the anecdote about the Parkway bridges has been increasingly questioned along with other details of Cairo's book. Bernward Georges, a German professor in sociology in 1999, carefully examined the saga of the bridges. In an essay, he acknowledged Moses was an undemocratic scoundrel and a structural racist, but argues that all parkways at the time had low bridges. That could be put into question. That really could be put into question. It could be. How then should one understand that Moses built some 200 overpasses so low? He asks, U.S. civil engineers with whom I have corresponded regularly produce two simple explanations for the rationality of the low-hanging bridges, that commercial traffic was excluded from the parkways anyway, and that the generally good transport situation on Long Island forbade the very considerable cost of raising the bridges. Moses did nothing different on Long Island from any park commissioner in the country, and some. Moses could hardly have let buses on his parkways, even if he had wanted differently. I call bullshit on that, but it is what it is. He also believes Cairo overstated the reason Black Americans did not go to Jones Beach. The fact remains that Blacks could gain physical access to Long Island beaches via many routes, and yet Jones Beach remained a white strand, he observed. Even today, when many more Blacks drive cars, and when no politician tries to exclude them from the beaches, not many poor Blacks seem to gather on Jones Beach. There existed then, and there exist today, many reasons for Black families to go elsewhere. But I call bullshit on that. I mean, we have an understanding so-called Black people will go to Jones Beach any chance they get, especially when it comes to the summertime, and they will have barbecues out there just like everybody else. And will participate in certain things like the July 4th fireworks and all those different things. But I mean, maybe it's different. And then you have to take into account, maybe it's just different in this period because of obviously the pandemic. But I mean, that shouldn't differentiate my opinion on it. Kenneth T. Jackson, a Columbia University historian who has said that generations of his students have failed to confirm episodes in Cairo's books, also says the overpass story is not true. Cairo is wrong, he wrote in an email. Arnold Vollmer, the landscape architect who was in charge of the design for the bridges, said the height was due to cost, he added. Also, you can still get to Jones Beach by train and bus, as you always could. Well, my opinion on that is, I mean, maybe because the 1930s, the whole entire Great Depression era, I mean, there's a lot of way to swing the story. It's not just one whole entire thought. I mean, but I'm still leaning to the fact of the matter, it definitely was racist. It definitely was an environmental racist thing that Robert Moses pulled towards so-called Black people. But I mean, I just wanted to share this video with you in order to just get down to what he was referencing. And I'm talking about Buttigieg, especially if those who don't know about Robert Moses. So, I mean, they have this whole entire thing, but I could share the article if anybody wants to see it. But more recently, Thomas J. Campanella, a Cornell University historian of city planning, had a change of heart when he had measured the height of the bridges on the Southern State Parkway. I've always had doubts about the veracity of the Jim Crow Bridge story. There is little question that Moses had patently bigoted views, which is true. There's nothing to deny. He wrote in an article for Bloomberg News in 2017. But then he recorded clearances for 20 bridges, viaducts, and overpasses on other parkways built at the time, compared them to measure of the 20 original bridges and overpasses on the Southern State Parkway, and turned out clearances are substantially lower on the Moses Parkway. The verdict? It appears that Sid Sharpio was right. And I mean, basically, you get the whole entire point. I'll let you read the rest of the article. It's not that much paragraphs, but I just wanted to make this a reference into the sequel of the video in which I was talking about with Pete Buttigieg, especially the thing that he was talking about, how he wanted to come up with the whole entire story about learning about Robert Moses, the city planner, during the 1930s up till the 1960s. My thing about it is simple. He's a liberal. The thing about it is a lot of these people out there is playing on the hamstrings of so-called Black people's emotions, because racism is always something that they're going to bring up in terms of this country. For those who disagrees, make sure that you put your comment in the comment section and tell me your thoughts. Peace.